Welcome. I am Michele Leclaire, Executive Director of Buckham Gallery. Today, I am chatting with Stephanie Serpick about her exhibition, Interior Visions, Domestic Sphere, on view through September 11. This exhibition may also be viewed on our website at buckhamgallery.org. Stephanie Serpick's paintings concern the themes of isolation and grief, and this was magnified during the pandemic. Our forced isolation and the challenges it brought to our physical and mental health provided a shared experience from which to consider grief and eventual healing. In the most recent work, images of windows, including blowing and or transparent curtains, lend a feeling of being cut off from the outside world. And like the bedding in the series, A New Fall, these paintings are devoid of a human presence and therefore feel lonely and isolating, reflecting what many have experienced during the pandemic. The paintings of beddings are represented by unmade beds and tossed sheets on intentionally blank, somewhat rough backgrounds. Both the empty bed and the windows represent a place for grief, solitude, and healing. As such, the work speaks to our shared feeling of trauma, with the understanding that while we all suffer in our individual ways, suffering is universal. Before we join the conversation, I would like to say thank you to our incredible audience, whether visiting the gallery in person or viewing these videos online, and to all the artists who submit to our exhibition calls. I appreciate you. Next, I would like to say a big thank you to the individuals and organizations who support Buckham Fine Arts Project and Gallery, including the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation, Michigan Arts and Culture Council, and the National Endowment for the Arts. The Greater Flint Arts Council Share Art Genesee Grant Program, made possible by the Genesee County Arts Education and Cultural Enrichment Millage funds. Your tax dollars at work. Thank you. Buckham Gallery is pleased to present the work of Stephanie Serpick and her solo exhibition, Interior Visions, Domestic Sphere. Stephanie Serpick is a painting whose work explores themes of isolation, grief, and healing. Her work has been shown in various exhibitions in the US and internationally, and she's attended several residencies, most notably the MassMoCA in North Adams, Massachusetts, the Florence Trust Studios in London, and the Vermont Studio Center. Recent exhibitions include solo shows at, Buckham Gallery, the College of Southern Nevada, and Sweetbriar College, and a two-person exhibition at the Munson Williams Proctor Arts Institute at the Museum of Art at Pratt in Utica, New York. She was awarded the Pollock Krasner Foundation grant in 2020, and in 2018, she received the Ruth and Harold Shenven Foundation grant. Stephanie received a BFA from Carnegie Mellon University and an MFA from the University of Chicago. Welcome, Stephanie. I love your quiet paintings, and I am really pleased to have this opportunity to learn more about you. So thank you for joining me here.
Thank you. I'm pleased that my work is there and available to your audience. It's a new audience for me too, so I'm happy to have my work shown there and in good company, the other artists too. So thank you for that.
Yeah, well, that's right. You are in New York, just right in the New York City area, sort of outside of, but
yeah, I recently moved a few months ago, actually earlier in the year. I was in Brooklyn. I'm still in New York. I'm just outside of the city in Nyack, which is just a few miles north of the city. So
yeah. So have you shown work out in the Midwest at all previously? Because I saw you went to school in Chicago, right?
I did. I went to grad school at the University of Chicago years ago now. So yeah, I mean, I spent a lot of time in Chicago, and so my work has been shown around different cities, but I don't think, not in Michigan. So it's nice to have it there.
Yeah, well, I am really excited to have it because it looks great. I think I really enjoyed the pairing with the other artists also, with your separate solo shows. But I think I jumped ahead of myself because I usually like to start these conversations with a little background information, like where you're from and what kind of led you to making art.
Yes, I am from Baltimore, Maryland, so I am from the East Coast, and as far as I started out drawing when I was a kid. I mean, I feel like it's something I've been doing my whole life. And I'm lucky that to be one of those people that it was never a question that I would pursue art, which was sort of fortunate to kind of like have a path. And I remember when I was a kid, I would sort of draw a lot. I mean, I was just thinking about this last night, drawing a lot from magazines, like fashion magazines. And I was thinking about how that's even led to the work that you have in the gallery, the work I'm doing now with this fabric in the beds and in the curtains, that I was really interested in fabric even then as a kid. And the kind of stuff that I was drawn to was like clothing, but it was really because of the, how the fabric looked, the folds and the drapery and stuff like that. So that's, always kind of been in my work in some form or other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
so then
that's
I moved to Chicago for grad school. I mean, went to college in Pittsburgh, Carnegie Mellon, and then moved to Chicago, and then moved back to the East Coast about 12 years ago. So nice to be back on the East Coast.
Yeah, I do miss the East Coast sometimes, but
yeah,
I lived in Philly for 10 years, so I had that experience, and we would occasionally take the bus up to New York, but probably didn't take advantage of that as much as I should have at the time. But it was always wonderful
when it's the time. Yeah. I hear you.
Okay, well, yeah, that's great. And I love to hear stories when people have started, like it was just always the drawing. And do you still draw from like the fashion magazines at all, or just other sources? And
yeah, I mean, I over really the course of my adult career, I started doing way back, doing like when I was in grad school and undergrad, doing like more representational work, and then kind of stopped and did some abstract work. It was pattern based, focused on sort of like color and form, and really kind of have jumped back and forth between doing abstract work and then more representational work, kind of back and forth. And then the some of the work that you have there, that's the bedding that I started in the fall of 2016. And so I've really kind of since then kind of stayed with this more representational work. But when going back to what you asked, I mean, at different times I would, and I have, referred to fashion magazines and clothing as a way to, generate kind of imagery and stuff, that I was drawn to. So yes, I mean, it has actually kind of come into my work over the years. Yeah.
How does your title, Interior Visions Domestic Sphere, relate to this body of work?
The work that you have is actually two different series that I'm still working on both of them, which is one is these beds, the bedding, and then the other are these windows with curtains. And I started the beds, like I said, it was in the fall of 2016, and those came out of a period of sort of anxiety and grief. It was a very tumultuous time in my life. My father was ill, and his health was declining, and just emotionally, a lot was going on in my life. And I had this feeling of wanting to be like escape from the world. So the bed sort of represented an escape from the outside world and a place to retreat to. And then I thought about using the idea as the bed as representing this escape, this sort of retreating from, the anxiety or grief or whatever is happening in a general sense. And then also the bed representing sort of a place for healing. So that was I thought of that as, this interior place, this interior, literally and emotionally, you're kind of turning inwards. And then I started doing the windows during the pandemic when we were more or less confined to our domestic spaces. And so both series kind of came from this domestic setting. So it was like literally, domestic, we're inside our homes, and then also the interior space of like, being inside emotionally and kind of processing, emotions and whatever that might be. So sort of the title kind of came naturally. And actually, I think I was reading a book, something that was written about Edward Hopper and his windows and his sort of spaces, and using the window as sort of the barrier between the interior life and exterior life, and how you kind of are engaging with the outside world through the window. And that seemed very relevant to what I was doing at the time, but it also kind of represented the beds too, as like this, physically you're in your bedroom, you're inside your house, apartment, whatever it is, and that as a retreat from the outside world.
Well, it's kind of interesting with the windows. This is what I have here at the moment. In a way, because the darkness kind of has that sort of solitude and quietness, and then that little bit of escape. Like you can almost like this is your opportunity to escape out into the world. But it looks very quiet out there too, so I don't know.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought that up, because the backgrounds, it seems, I think at first glance, like it's just this dark black background that, doesn't have any relevance or resonance. And the backgrounds were really important when I started making the paintings. When I started the beds, the background sort of represented the outside world. And it was a way of like, blanking out the outside world to kind of retreat into the bed, like what's real present, if in your bed or looking at your bed, you kind of want to escape everything. And it is hard to see in on the slides or in photographs, but the backgrounds themselves have a lot of texture to them, or like not like a literal texture, but I use a process of sanding the painting. So I'll put down a thin layer of paint, and then when it's dry, sand it and kind of repeat that, so it has what looks like, a roughness, like a little bit of a texture. And that was really important. That represented, this exterior world and the trauma or, whatever was happening outside of that space. And I kind of carried that into the windows also, kind of using that to represent the whatever is going on outside of the actual foreground, the actual object.
That's interesting. With the sanding process, it does, well, and unfortunately, we are limited with what you can do on remote. That's why people need to come into the gallery to see the painting, always. But it does change with the sheen versus, yes, gloss versus more matte areas from the process of the working. So, yeah. It's definitely there, and why we like to see art in person.
Yes, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's sometimes, it's, that's the struggle. For a lot of artists too, like in, capturing them in photographs is, you sort of miss a lot of like the detail that's, in the actual work. So unfortunately.
Yeah, definitely. And then you have things like, your shadow and glare when just photographing. So you have to be further away to get that out, but then you lose some of the detail also when you crop it down, which is, yeah.
No, that's
photographing art is a skill in its own.
Yes. Making it is one thing, but yeah.
Yes.
And getting it to other people, photographically is a whole other thing. Yeah.
It is, yeah. All things. So your artist statement describes themes of isolation and grief, as you just mentioned. Do you mind if the viewers have their own interpretation of the paintings because they leave your studio and they go out into the world and people bring their own, backgrounds and experiences when they view the work? How do you feel about that?
That's great. I totally. I like that as a viewer of art too, kind of like bringing your own experiences and your own interpretations. When it comes to my work, I think these paintings are, or I hope that they are suggestive of an emotion or of a feeling, but they're not specific. They are sort of these objects, the beds, the windows, whatever, that for me represent something, but I am really happy for other people to bring, what their their own interpretations of, you know, what they see in this imagery. I think they have, at least in my interpretation and in my hope, is that you know, there is in some of them this heavy feeling. You know, a lot of the earlier ones I felt, you know, had this sadness or depression. You know, had, you know, that emotion. So I don't, I mean, I hope people kind of pick up on that, but I mean, obviously if they don't, that's fine too. The fact that they are empty beds, that there's on and all of the paintings, there's no actual people. There's evidence of people having been there perhaps, but, you know, no actual humans. And I think that kind of may give an impression of, you know, these places that were left or abandoned, or, you know, the beds having been slept on, or, you know, kind of, and there might be an interpretation with that, which, you know, I hope comes through, may or may not come through. But I think, and also the backgrounds, again, sort of the backgrounds being these kind of heavier, dark, blank spaces may kind of also lend a feeling to that. I think the windows also are vague. You know, it's not clear. It's even less clear, I think, than some of the beds, because some of them, it's hard to tell if you're inside or outside. You know, are you viewing in somebody else's space? Are you on the inside viewing out? And that kind of lends a level of ambiguity, which I appreciate. I mean, I want people to kind of, you know, bring their own ideas and interpretations. So yeah, I'm totally happy with whatever people want to read into them.
Yeah, I think it definitely comes across, especially with like the empty beds, or sort of like intimate interactions, or sleeplessness and insomnia, like maybe of having, for whatever reason, whether it's grief or some anxiety that is keeping you from sleeping, of course, and then getting up, it's like, okay, I'm over. I can't be in this space any longer. I have to get out. But definitely, especially with the beds, there was a human presence here.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, that was sort of something that I thought about, you know, so they came out of sort of this experience of grief or trauma, or I know I'm using these same words, but I intentionally wanted them to be interpreted by every, you know, people who experience their, whatever that means for them, you know, whatever particular trauma or anxiety, or, you know, whatever that is. Everybody has their own experience of that in their own lives, and I wanted that. I wanted people to kind of bring that, you know, their interpretation into something that's, you know, just a bed, you know, just sort of this object that doesn't tell you how to feel, but, you know, kind of, you're going to read what you want through those paintings.
One of our outreach projects is we have one of our programs, we have a writer in residence, where each year for each exhibition season, we have a literary artist who actually comes into the gallery and experiences the works in person, and then responds to them in their literary arts. And then we will compile it with their work, with their compositions, with images from the exhibitions. And then at the end of their residency, and have that available. And so our current writer was in last week and was really kind of talking about it. And it was kind of interesting to hear his interpretations as sort of like, you know, your lover has left, you know, the bed. And he's writing sort of an interesting for each of the paintings. So I'll be pleased to share that with you when it's all done. But I kind of enjoyed that too, you know, this other other feeling for it. Yeah. You kind of touched on this a little bit, but did you start the paintings with a story of isolation in mind? Or did it develop through the process of working? And you know, when I prepared this, I said during the pandemic, because you had touched on that in your artist statement, but if especially the bed paintings, you said started in like 2016, so maybe that's was of course prior. So you know, was that your story to begin with, or did it kind of come?
Yeah, When I started the beds, yeah, obviously it was a few years prior to the pandemic, and it wasn't so much isolation as looking inwards, and so not sort of like a literal isolation, but you're kind of like looking internally, and it was isolation in that way,
Mhm.
in this interior way, and I think it was based out of my personal experience, which wanting to kind of retreat from the world. So that meant kind of retreating from other people around me, other, family. And it was so isolating in that way, less about the pandemic, but, isolating because you're wanting to, kind of turn inward and, heal or grieve or whatever that is. And that really did become magnified in the pandemic when it became sort of a literal isolation. And that was when I started doing the curtains, the window paintings, because I was, you're spending a lot of time, or I was spending a lot of time, kind of like looking out the window. I was living in Brooklyn then, you're watching the world outside, um, and at that time, earlier in the pandemic, and other people had this experience too, but in New York City, it was, lots of ambulances and sirens, and you'd look out the window, and I was living in a big building where you'd see ambulances pull up and kind of put on all of the gear, the paramedics, and it was really sort of a traumatic time in a different way, watching what was happening from the inside of your apartment, just kind of like witnessing what was happening in the world. And so that sort of thinking about these barriers, the windows as these sort of like barriers between the inside and the outside, and that was sort of what inspired me to do the paintings. And I, had to, whereas normally I would go out to my studio, which is outside of my home, like a lot of people had to, bring the work inside, and was kind of confined to my home for a period of time. And, so the isolation was even more magnified, as it was for a lot of people, in that respect too.
It's kind of interesting to think of being in New York City, or and there's so many people kind of in a space, but then to be confined and isolated, but near, I don't know, what quite an experience.
I'm sure there's been a lot of people who's talked about this and made work about it. The idea of, you're stacked in your little boxes with your neighbors and people, and you hear people above and below you in the apartments next door, and you're aware constantly of people being around. But this also, I mean, especially early in the pandemic, this like fearfulness that like, do we interact with other people? How do we interact with people? Can we interact with other people? They're there, we hear them, we know they're there, but like, what does that mean in our, I mean, that just was a scary time in the world, but that sort of strange feeling of like, it is an isolation, even though there's awareness of people being around everywhere. Yeah, it was definitely kind of a weird time that I think impacted the work.
Yeah. So were you able to escape your apartment to like go on walks, and was it then crowded outside also?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I was around. Yeah, I would go outside like every day for a walk. And I mean, this is kind of an aside, but my husband and I, on the weekends, we would go for like long drives. So we would sort of drive outside of the city and go to Long Island or come outside of the city. And actually that's sort of what's led to us moving here. I mean, we didn't move during the height of the pandemic. We only moved earlier this year, but, kind of experiencing these other areas outside of New York City that led us to actually move outside of the city, ironically. But yeah, I mean, being in the city, it was, I mean, like there were people outside, lots of people around. It was, we would there every, I think, Sunday evening, like the apartment building across from us. So there was the apartment building across from us that I think a couple musicians lived there, and every Sunday there was 5 or 7 or whatever time it was, they would set up on the porch and like just play a couple songs, and it became this like regular thing. And we would, open our windows and watch, and people would stop on the street, and it, even these very scary times, watching kind of people come together was sort of this really nice thing.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. Even like I live in like a downtown neighborhood, but people in the neighborhood was much more active outside during that time. Also, just all of a sudden, everyone was out getting their walks and their bike rides, and the dogs were getting walked a lot more than they used to. My dog loved it.
Yep.
Yeah, you would see people kind of on different ends of driveways with their folding chairs and whatnot, kind of hanging outside, just like, okay, we got to get out of the house. Yeah. But there's a lot of time I can also picture being inside and looking at the curtains kind of blowing and being inside looking at the world. Also, yeah. So I absolutely love your use of light in the paintings. And it seems like it almost has not a personality, but it's a starring role of the painting. Like, can you maybe share a little bit about the role of light?
Sure. Yes. I think to talk about the role of light, I need to talk about where the imagery comes from. And actually it comes from all over the place. I mean, a lot of them are found images found online, or some of them are photographs I've taken or my husband has taken, or photos that people have shared with me. So that, I'm kind of looking everywhere for images to use for the paintings. And something that I'm looking for or looking at when I'm choosing to paint an image is the light and the light quality, since I'm kind of, drawing on found images. And it's hard to describe exactly what it is I'm looking for, that feeling when you just sort of know it when you see it. So there's a bit of that, but I think for a while when I was looking at images, I was looking at, if not direct light, kind of light that looked like it was coming from like a specific source. There's a window nearby, or a bedside light that might shine on the bed in a certain way. And it was more of like how that affected how the bed or the curtain looked, rather than kind of trying to look for a specific quality. I feel like I'm not saying this because it is indefinable. It is sort of hard to explain exactly. I agree. Light is a crucial part of these paintings. Absolutely. Yeah. It's hard for me to put into words exactly how to talk about that. Clearly I'm struggling to talk about it, or like, where to find what the right light is. I go back to you so kind of know.
It's an intuitive process, right? Because it's even in like even like how you are set up right now with your skylights and the dark, and so you have it's okay for it to be intuitive, and maybe it's really the role that the black is playing. It has to be the supported role, maybe. I'm not sure.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. That's a really good point. I'm glad you mentioned it, because that is true. I mean, I can look at an image that has, the other, outside of the bed or outside of the window. It could be like a bright sunny day or a bright room, but yes, making the background black does have a real, impact on how the actual subject matter kind of appears. And I do take that into consideration. I should also say, I kind of, even though I'm referencing an image, I don't always use it directly. I might like heighten the light a little bit, kind of bring out some light elements or push back some darker elements to, kind of bring out a certain level of contrast, intentionally kind of looking for the right light, for the paintings. And I think it also kind of draws a certain attention in a certain way. I know, well, I should say, I've always looked at a lot of still life paintings, like, traditional kind of, historical still life as a genre is sort of something I've always been interested in. And those often have, a dark background or a, kind of a muted background, with the focus being on whatever is on the table, or, whatever it is. And I was thinking about that kind of quality too when I was making these, kind of thinking about these as still life paintings, where the background is kind of pushed back and then the focus is on whatever's in the foreground, and how the light kind of reflects on that. I mean, I was definitely looking at, I refer to a lot of like still life books that I have and kind of see how the light is used in those too. I think that's sort of an intuitive choice, but something that kind of has been in my brain from looking at these paintings for so long too.
Yeah, and in a way, they're kind of like the ultimate still life,
This is
Yes.
it. Yeah. Yeah, that's a
Oh, that's great. Yeah, of course. And they're loaded with memory, just like those, like the
Yeah.
Flemish and Belgian still lifes.
Yes.
Where each item has its representation. I mean, these do as well. Yeah.
Exactly.
So you mentioned the historic still life paintings as an influence. What other influences do you have on you in the fashion magazines as a child, of course? Which honestly, I do see in the folds of the fabrics, and in many ways, even though it is a bed or a window, they're ultimately an abstract painting.
Yes, that's true.
I definitely see that in the works also. Yeah. But what other influences, life or art are you feeling?
Yeah. Just to sort of you pointing that out about the abstract paintings, just a quick aside. When I started making these, some were more. I was thinking about this when I first started the series, like the first handful of them. I think for the beds, I've made over 40. So I don't even know how many I have to.
Yeah.
But they were they became sort of these like landscapes or abstracted because it wasn't always recognizable as a bed, or not immediately. Some sort of had like what looked like mountains or waves or whatever. These more like landscapes or abstracted shapes, and I kind of love that about them, that they didn't always kind of look tangible. You didn't always see a pillow. You just sort of like the shape of a sheet, like the edge of a sheet.
Yeah.
Which I kind of love that too. But definitely sort of landscape paintings for sure I've always looked at landscape paintings. When I started doing the windows and the curtains, I was looking at, I mentioned Edward Hopper, and there are a couple of other painters whose names I'm gonna forget, that did a lot of like more architectural kind of paintings. And again, back to like Dutch and Flemish. I mean, I feel like that's sort of this history of painting that, sort of the quality of the light maybe, or whatever it is about these paintings that really have had a big impact on me, whether it's still life or architecture or something else. And you're right. I mean, I'm always looking at drapery in whatever form that may take. That's fashion magazines, if that's like towels hanging up or whatever. I'm always kind of noticing drapery in whatever form that is. And that's always kind of played a big part in my work in general.
Yeah, I really like when you mentioned sort of the landscape feel, that one, or abstractly the one painting where the it's just like the twisted sheet that's really, you could see, and then it's everything else that fades away. And then with like the and then, as you meant, the windows, the sort of that billowing, the potential of that, and the light kind of coming through with those paintings, I really.
There's it's I think it's the only vertical you have. I hardly do any verticals, but that's that one weird green curtain that is one of the most, I think, abstracted of those paintings I've ever done. And I think for that reason, it's one of my favorites of those, just because it's this weird ghostly shape. I think if you didn't see it in context of the other curtains, you might, I don't even know if it's recognizable as a curtain. And I kind of like love that about it, that it's like one of the weirdest of them.
That's true. You know, without the other windows and with them, it wouldn't necessarily right away how that it could be ghostly. Yeah, yeah.
I mean, actually, using the word ghostly, I kind of, I think that could be used for a lot of the paintings. I mean, the beds too.
Hmm.
There's
Hmm.
definitely a ghostly quality about them, especially since there are no people.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Well, so what's next? Are you continuing with these series, or do you have any other fancies?
I'm continuing with both the beds and the curtains. I kind of took a break from the beds, but I don't feel like I got it out of my system.
Yeah.
40 whatever paintings later, it's not out of my system, but I'm starting to look at them in a different way. And I mean, I feel like I could probably happily keep making them like forever, but trying to incorporate other elements, whether that's I did a couple paintings that have like a strip, a line down the middle. I'm doing some that kind of play with the edges a little bit, so kind of like they breaking the image a little bit apart. I'm not going to explain this well, so I have to
Yeah.
work through
Right.
moving images a little so they kind of don't line up. But there's just sort of like shifts in using this imagery, just thinking about using the bed in a different way and handling the imagery in a different way, and what that might mean in the end result, like how that comes across. Does that metaphorically think about different shifts or different like emotional shifts, or kind of like a literal shift in the image? How does that appear as a finished product? So I'm working through it. It's like early days, but I'm excited to kind of continuing with imagery that I've really enjoyed working with, but like thinking about it in other ways. So I'm excited about how that goes.
Yeah. Well, I look forward to seeing some of those. And then I spent a little time on your website yesterday. The drawings, were those more of like the fabrics and like those had a more of the abstract feeling to them also.
Yeah,
Some of them.
yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, those were so much, and it's been like a handful of years since I've worked on those, but I periodically
Mhm.
sort of like come back to that and do more drawings or think about sort of plans for more drawings. And yes, those were like again more like fashion magazine type.
Yeah.
Can't seem to get away from it, obviously. But yeah, because it's just like the quality of the fabric and how it hangs and how it drapes.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. Oh, well, this has been really great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's been a great conversation. And I'm sure I said earlier, well, thank you for sharing your work with our Greater Flint audience and our virtual audience as well. Really appreciate having this opportunity and to getting to know you a little more.
Yeah, me too. Thank you for hosting the show and having this talk. It's been really nice to talk to you and talk about the work a bit, and hope people can come see it.
Oh, well, again, thank you, Stephanie. It was really great to learn more about her paintings and her work and really sort of that shared experience we all felt for the past few years. So thank you, Stephanie, and for you for watching and being a part of this experience. Thank you. Bye.